So we've covered technical and economic feasibility. Let's move on to legal. This one's actually relatively straightforward because not an awful lot of the laws actually apply to what you're trying to do. But we'll look at what a legal feasibility test is, why you would conduct one, and how you would conduct one. And this, of course, is relating to laws that apply to the solution that you've created for Justin. So it's another test that we're running here. You need to focus on UK legislation, because we're within the UK, and regulation that relates to storing and using information. And that's for Justin and the Just Drive app. More specifically, the impact and the consequences of UK legislation and regulation on Justin in the way that he handles information and individuals' personal data. Because don't forget, Justin is going to be handling people's names, people's addresses, and you've got a list, and that came with the brief, of the information that he's collecting. So you will need to go through that again with a fine-tooth comb and have a look at the information that he's collecting. And this will be about what he collects, how he uses it, and what he does with it. And I'm sure you're getting flashbacks now to Unit 2, when you were talking about general data protection and GDPR in particular. And you will need to consider the actions that Justin will need to take to comply with legislation and regulations within the UK. That rather long list of laws actually comes down to just these 3 that you can see there, and I've boiled them down here. 1, 2, 3. These are the 3 that you need to be concerned with: the Data Protection Act, the Information Commissioner's Office Codes of Practice, and Copyright Design and Patents. I imagine the last one's pretty obvious to you, as is the first one. The middle one, you might be scratching your head and thinking, what on earth is that for? Well, I'll go through it in a moment. For the purpose of this task, the Data Protection Act is your main consideration. The Information Commissioner's Office one, you're going to pay lip service because you're going to look at it and decide whether it applies to you or not, and that will be purely based around the dashcam footage part of your solution. And copyright is obvious about not using other people's intellectual property. So first of all, with the Data Protection Act, explain what the Act covers and how the Act impacts on Justin and Just Drive, and that's about information and how he keeps it. Explain what Justin needs to do to comply with the regulation, and also what are the consequences of non-compliance. So let's look at the principles of the Data Protection Act. You'll remember all of this from Unit 2. Lawful fare, the accountability, integrity, all of this, you're going to need to do a very short resume of what the Data Protection Act principles are. And I think that for this part it is perfectly acceptable for you to copy and paste a chunk of text as long as you cite your sources. Actions to comply. These are the questions that you're going to need to ask as to what Justin's doing with the data. Does he have a record of the personal data that he holds? Do you know what he uses it for? Do people know you have their personal data and understand how you use it? Now, all of these questions here, and I think I've got in total 8 questions, these I actually took from, if you look at the bottom, Making Data Protection Your Business, Resources for Sole Traders, and the website's on the bottom right there. Those were the questions that a sole trader would ask of their business in order to decide whether they're compliant with GDPR regulations. So go through those and ask those questions of the data that's being collected for Justin. Once you've done that, then explain the consequences of non-compliance to him and to his clients. So what would be the consequences for the clients, for example, of personal data being lost? Thinking about what data Justin collects. This is potentially sounding like a bigger job than it is, because actually Justin's not collecting an awful lot of data, but you will still need to run these tests over the data that he is collecting to make sure that you are GDPR compliant. Right, let's go on to Information Commissioner's Office Codes of Practice. This legislation was in the main written to cover CCTV and surveillance. Now, you're not doing any surveillance and you don't have CCTV, but you do have the potential of this dashcam feature. So you need to explain how that will impact on Justin. And the Information Commissioner's Office Codes of Practice only applies when you capture information that is of identifiable individuals. So if you're not capturing information of people's faces, then this legislation won't apply to you, but you will need to be clear that you aren't doing that. So again, just run that test over the data that you're collecting, and explain what Justin needs to do to comply to that, and the consequences again of non-compliance. Lastly, and this one's pretty straightforward, the Copyright Designs and Patent Act 1988. Talk about what it covers and about how it impacts Justin and Just Drive and the design of the app. What does he need to do to comply? Very simply, the designer of this app needs to ensure that he or she does not either copy or do non-literal copying of anyone else's work, and list the consequences. Let's talk about copying first of all. The closer to the original that your copy is, the stronger the infringement. So if you copy a substantial amount of someone else's work, you're likely to find yourself in hot water, and it'll be quite easy to prove. The other one is non-literal copying, and this is important for applications and programs, and it's when it's copying chains of operations, functions, interfaces and styles. The program code might be totally different, but actually the way that the program's organized is logically very similar. Now, again, this is very unlikely because the app that you're producing is a standard app that's been made thousands and thousands of times, and whether someone actually has copyright over the sorts of functions and operations that you're producing is pretty unlikely. But it's worth mentioning that in your briefing.